This is what I will call message number 18A in my Beginning of Birth Pains series. It's entitled The Unprecedented Catastrophes in the Beginning of Birth Pains. This message and the next will cover chapter 18 in my book, which is rather long, and so I'm going to divide it into two messages. First, let's have a review of the beginning of the end times. As noted in the first message of this series, the last generation church will be present on the earth during the beginning of birth pains. This was clearly demonstrated from Scripture in the previous book, Christ's Endtimes Teaching. The following table summarizes a suggested order for 6 primary events in the very beginning of the end times. So we see here first the 10-nation coalition forming, which will unite with the Antichrist to destroy end-time Babylon. I discussed that in the book in chapters 4 through 6. Second will be Antichrist's rise as he rises up after the establishment of this 10-nation coalition, emerges first as a famous ruler of a small country in the vicinity of Russia. I discussed that in the book in chapters 8 and 9. Then at some point in time will be Antichrist's resurrection. In my opinion, this is the clearest sign that the end times have begun. And I've discussed that in several chapters of this book. And then following rather immediately after Antichrist's resurrection, I believe there will be Antichrist's religious covenant, which is predicted in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. And I've discussed that in chapters number 14 and 15 of the book. There's another event that will happen sometime, I believe, in the beginning of the end times, particularly during the second seal. I will discuss that more in a moment. This will be when the Antichrist and 10-nation coalition unite to annihilate the economic superpower on earth by consuming it with fire in 1 hour, such that no one will ever live there again. That's what Revelation chapter 17 through 18 are predicting. I talk about that in a book that I devote to that entire topic, Endtime Babylon, which is book number 3 in the Endtimes Essentials series. Again, I'll say more about that in just a moment. Finally, we have wars, famines, plagues, and earthquakes during the beginning of birth pains, and these will combine to kill the people living on 1/4 of the earth, and will especially result from the nuclear warfare used to destroy end-time Babylon, in my opinion. And that's what I discuss in chapter 18. It might be noted that the majority of the book, The Beginning of Birth Pains, is concentrated on describing the events that are reflected in the very first seal of Revelation chapter 6. This chapter 18, and these next two messages will focus on the rest of the seals of the book of Revelation. So we've discussed events number 1 through 4 in that table in the previous messages. Event number 5, again, will be discussed in an entire another book called Endtime Babylon. And therefore, the topic of these next two messages, this message and the next, will be event number 6, which again portrays the the second, third, and fourth seal in Revelation chapter 6. So let's read Revelation chapter 6 and see those seals. Starting in verse 1, we read, "I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, 'Come.' I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, 'Come.' Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, 'Come.' I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine.' When the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, 'Come.' I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over 1/4 of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth." An introduction to this scroll, which contains Christ's wrath and an explanation of the purpose of the seals of preparation, was provided in my first book, Christ's Endtimes Teaching. It is important to remember that these first 4 seals are not Christ's end times wrath. Instead, they prepare the world for Christ's end times wrath. Revelation chapter 6 itself makes it clear that it is only with the opening of the sixth seal that we read the wrath of the Lamb has come, verses 16 through 17. Rather than being Christ's wrath, the beginning of birth pains portrayed in the first four seals seem to be empowered by demonic forces ultimately allowed by God during the beginning of birth pains. The purpose of the first five seals, including the greatest persecution, which is reflected in the fifth seal, is to prepare the world for Christ's wrath, which will be unleashed with the opening of the sixth seal. Therefore, throughout the Endtimes Essentials, these seals are referred to as the seals of preparation. More specifically, the seals probably portray the activities of one demon-possessed person in particular, the Antichrist. He is the one portrayed as emerging on the earth in the first seal. It is he who will be ultimately responsible for the martyred in the fifth seal, portraying the results of the greatest persecution. It would seem the actions of the Antichrist will also be ultimately responsible for the catastrophic war and resulting famine described in the second and third seals. This conclusion will also be supported more in the book Endtime Babylon. Therefore, it seems the riders on the four horsemen of the apocalypse, as they're often called, may be portraying the Antichrist in all of his deceptive and destructive activities during the beginning of birth pains. Why is the imagery of the four horses abandoned after the fourth seal? One reason may be that the imagery reflects the progression and sequence of end-time events from what Jesus called the beginning of birth pains to the greatest persecution. Accordingly, the first four seals portray the results of the events in the beginning of birth pains, and the fifth seal, the results of the greatest persecution. It was argued elsewhere that this sequence and labeling of end-time events is important. Therefore, it may be reflected in the change of imagery in the seals of preparation in Revelation chapter 6. Revelation 6 also confirms that the events of the beginning of birth pains will not be happening all at once. On the contrary, the emergence of the Antichrist portrayed by the rider on a white horse will come before and be followed by the wars, symbolized by the rider on a fiery red horse with a large sword, who will be given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. Likewise, the famines, earthquakes, and plagues will follow and be a result of the wars. Let us also notice again that the general sequence of end-time events being portrayed in this passage of Christ's revelation lines up exactly with the sequence of end-time events in Christ's Endtimes Teaching. With the opening of each seal of preparation, progressive events of the beginning of birth pains will occur. These seals can be summarized in the following table. So we see the first seal in the previous messages. It was argued that the first seal portrays the emergence of the Antichrist, the first and foremost of the false Christ that Jesus warned of. It has also been suggested that this revelation of the Antichrist at the very beginning of the end times will include Antichrist's resurrection, which will rather immediately be followed by Antichrist's covenant, religious covenant with the world and the implementation of his religion. Therefore, it has also been claimed that the opening of the first seal portrays the first certain sign the end times have begun with the Antichrist's resurrection. Next, we see the second seal. The text quoted above from Revelation 6 described this seal as the coming of a rider on a red horse, unleashing war on the earth, which Jesus also warned about as part of the beginning of birth pains. The opening of the third seal portrays a rider on a black horse bringing severe economic hardship and reflects the famines that Jesus warned about in his end-time sermon. Finally, the fourth seal portrays a rider on a pale horse, adding more catastrophes to the beginning of birth pains and resulting in the deaths of the people living on 1/4 of the earth. More details regarding the opening of the second, third, and fourth seals will be discussed again in this message. So let us first discuss the second seal and end-time wars. As argued previously, the opening of the first seal depicting a rider that rode out on a white horse conquering probably refers to the resurrected Antichrist emerging onto the world scene and establishing peace. I've argued for that in previous messages. But with the opening of the second seal, we read, "Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people violently slaughter each other. To him was given a large sword." The suggested translation here generally follows the NIV. It seems this seal is describing catastrophic, even nuclear war. First, this horse is described as being fiery red. Versions that simply translate the Greek here as red are less than accurate. John does not use the regular Greek word for red here. Rather, he uses a root word for fire, and therefore both the Greek lexicon and the NIV render this as fiery red. This fiery red may have something to do with the kind of warfare being described here. Therefore, it could be referring to the powerful rockets used to launch and propel nuclear missiles, or it could refer to the great fires that the nuclear warheads will cause upon impact. More evidence for this will be discussed again in the book Endtime Babylon. It is commonly thought that humans would never be foolish enough to unleash nuclear weapons in the world. But notice the prophecy says the demonic rider on the fire red horse will be given supernatural power to take peace from the earth and to make people violently slaughter each other. Power, the words power and make are not in the Greek text, but reflect the NIV translation. The text literally says the rider, quote, was granted to take peace from the earth and that they would slaughter one another. Therefore, a God-given authority, as the NLT puts it, or power, as in the NIV, being given to the Antichrist is being reflected here. And that power will be used to make people violently slaughter each other. Next, we see the nature of this warfare. People will violently slaughter each other. Regarding the Greek word used here, it was noted in a previous message, quote, the Greek word for violently slaughtered is not the normal Greek word for kill. Rather, the word used here means, quote, slaughter, killing a person by violence, or murder someone. In addition, Mounts points out this is not the normal word for death in battle. Therefore, violently slaughter is a good translation. Webster's defines slaughter as to kill in a bloody or violent manner, to kill in large numbers. This again could certainly reflect the use of nuclear weapons, and so does the next reference to a large sword. The weapon used is not described as a literal weapon of a sword, but is metaphorically described as a mega sword. This would suggest a weapon with more killing power than normal. In fact, the result of the war unleashed in the second seal will largely contribute to the 1/4 of the earth that will be killed during the beginning of birth pains, as described in the fourth seal. All of this again seems to suggest the use of nuclear weapons, in my opinion. Accordingly, Robert Thomas writes of the second seal, quote, it is a span of slaughter and bloodshed. This is warfare in its most feared form. All in all, it is better to assign the slaughter to a broad connotation of the violent taking of life through warfare. This will be a visitation resulting in great carnage, unquote. I want to next talk about the annihilation of end-time Babylon. The wars unleashed in the second seal seem to include the destruction of end-time Babylon described in Revelation chapter 17 through 18. There we are given a prophecy about the total annihilation of a people and place called the Great Prostitute, or Babylon the Great. Book number 3 in the Endtimes Essentials series, entitled Endtime Babylon, is devoted to a biblical exegesis of this prophetic scripture. Its key text is Revelation chapter 17, verse 16, and the following suggested translation will be supported in the book Endtime Babylon. We read in that verse, the 10 horns that you saw in the beast will hate the prostitute, and these will permanently remove all people from her and strip her naked, and they will completely devour her body and will completely burn her up with fire. Now, the clearest and most repeated description of Babylon the Great in this prophecy describes it as the economic superpower of the world. When the end times begin, its superior wealth and its promotion of the worship of wealth will suppress the Antichrist from the full rulership and worship of the world. I believe that's reflected in Revelation chapter 17, verses 3 and 7. It is also repeatedly described as a spiritual prostitute that at one time served God, but becomes a foremost practitioner and promoter of the sinful idolatry of wealth. In addition, at least 4 more attributes of end-time Babylon can be derived from this passage in order to identify it. The book End-time Babylon will argue that by far the best interpretation of Babylon the Great and the Great Prostitute is the United States of America. Because end-time Babylon will hinder the 10-nation end-time coalition and the Antichrist from coming to full power, the 10 horns and the beast will hate the prostitute, and these will permanently remove all people from her and completely burn her up with fire. 3 times, the prophecy states end-time Babylon's complete annihilation will occur in 1 literal hour. The result will be that no people will ever live there again. As the prophecy states, no worker of any trade will ever be found in it again. The voice of bridegroom and bride will never be heard in it again. This suggests the kind of nuclear warfare reflected above in the description of the second seal. In addition, this is why it was argued elsewhere that some nations in the 10-nation end-time coalition will possess nuclear weapons. Indeed, many many biblical arguments that will be given in the book Endtime Babylon to demonstrate that the destruction of Babylon the Great, or America, occurs during the catastrophic wars portrayed in the second seal. Accordingly, American Christians will be on earth at the time Endtime Babylon is attacked and destroyed by the Antichrist and the 10-nation Endtime coalition. Therefore, correctly understanding Revelation chapter 17 through 18 and the identity and destruction of Babylon the Great is vitally important. The topic is introduced here because the timing of its destruction and end-time events best fits the wars of the second seal. And again, I'll support that more in the book, Endtime Babylon. But again, the biblical arguments for all of these things that I've just mentioned will be in that book. Let us next talk about war in Christ's Endtimes teaching. Jesus gave his own commentary on the wars during the beginning of birth pains. In a suggested translation of Matthew chapter 24, verse 6, we read, "You will hear reports of devastating wars and riots, but guard yourself against fear and make sure you are not alarmed. These horrific conflicts must happen, but my coming and the end of the age will not follow the wars immediately." The translation here translates a Greek word which can mean account, report, or message. And this is better than the NIV rumors or NLT threats, which suggests they will not be real wars. The reports will be about real and even very devastating wars, but the people who merely hear reports of them will not be in the wars. They will be in places on the earth where the wars are not happening. As Hagner writes, Christ's words refer to, quote, reports of wars more distant, unquote. The Good News translation translates it as, quote, you are going to hear the news of battles far away. The translation, devastating wars and horrific conflicts, reflect the kind of events that would cause God's people to have fear and be alarmed. In Luke, it says that they'll be terrified and panic. So small skirmishes will not have such an effect. These are talking about massive, devastating, horrific wars and conflicts. The suggested translation reflects that Christ was warning of two different types of conflicts, in my opinion, which would be large wars and smaller riots. Granted, Matthew translated him as using essentially the same Greek word twice, palamos. Accordingly, most versions, like the NIV, choose to translate it as wars both times, resulting in the rather redundant statement, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. But it seems more likely Jesus intended to differentiate the events he was speaking of. Accordingly, palamos has a rather wide range of meaning, including these three. 1, war. 2, a single engagement, battle, or fight. 3, a more general state of hostility, strife, conflict, quarrel. Therefore, instead of having Jesus simply warn of wars twice in one phrase, the suggested translation reflects the third meaning of palamos and adds riots. It seems Jesus was not only warning of massive conflicts when nation will go to war against nation and kingdom against kingdom, as he refers to in verse 7. He was also warning of a more general and localized state of hostility, strife, conflict, quarrels between individuals all over the world. This fits Luke's version of Christ's statement. There, Jesus says, when you hear of wars and disturbances, do not be terrified. The Greek word here is a virtual synonym for the third use of palamos above, meaning unsettled state of affairs, disturbance, a tumult, or opposition to established authority, disorder, unruliness. A suggested translation of riots for the meaning of both of these Greek words fits their meaning well. Webster's defines riots as a violent public disorder, a tumultuous disturbance of the public peace. Accordingly, it is suggested that in both Matthew 24, verse 6 and Luke 21, 9, Jesus was warning of both massive wars between nations and kingdoms and more localized hostilities, conflicts, and riots between and among groups of people. No doubt, such violence in communities all over the world will especially increase with the opening of the second seal of war and the resulting third seal of severe economic hardship. Famine and massive shortages of necessities will make people desperate in the beginning of birth pains. This desperation will also lead to violence. As Jesus predicted during this same time, quote, sin will be rampant everywhere, and the love of many will grow cold. Finally, the suggested translation has, guard yourself against fear and make sure you are not alarmed. This reflects a Greek word that means, quote, to be alert or on guard, pay attention. Jesus is implying that the wars and riots will be so horrific that even his people will be tempted to have great fear and be alarmed that the end of the world has already come. This again could imply the use of nuclear weapons. But Jesus corrected such thinking and said, "My coming and the end of the age will not follow the wars immediately, because, for one thing, all these other seals need to be opened." This suggested translation reflects the context of the verse in verse 3. Next, let's talk about Antichrist wars. Notice that Jesus predicted multiple end-time wars, plural. As it says in Daniel, war and its destruction and horrors have been determined by God to continue to the very end of the world, Daniel 9:26. Indeed, from the beginning of birth pains to the worldwide rebellion at the end of Christ's 1,000-year reign, Scripture predicts many wars to the very end of the world. These include, in some order, first, the rising Antichrist military victories resulting in the downfall of 3 leaders in the 10-nation end-time coalition and portrayed in the first seal. Again, I've talked about that in message number 11 of this series. Secondly, an alliance of the Antichrist and the 10-nation end-time coalition to destroy Babylon the Great, the world's economic superpower, with fire in 1 hour so that no one will live there again. Again, that's in Revelation chapter 17 through 18, and I will discuss that in detail in the book Endtime Babylon. Third, the Antichrist will attack and destroy Jerusalem at the time of his claim to be God, or the abomination of desolation, breaking his religious covenant with Israel at its midpoint. That's, of course, described in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, and this will be discussed more in another book as well, The Greatest Persecution. Fourth, an army of 200 million demonic creatures will kill 1/3 of all the people living on the earth during Christ's wrath. That is described in Revelation chapter 9. Now, some suggest that this is people from China, an army from China of 200 million men. That's not what that prophecy is describing. Clearly, it's demonic creatures. Fifth, at the end of Christ's wrath, the Antichrist will gather the armies of the world to Israel for the Battle of Armageddon. Sixth, at the end of Christ's 1,000-year reign on this earth, a number of people likened to the grains of sand on the seashore will attack Jerusalem and be destroyed by fire from heaven. That's in Revelation chapter 20. After that, a new heavens and new earth will be created, and there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain or war, because the old order of things has passed away for eternity. Revelation chapter 21. But as noted earlier in the Endtimes Essentials series, in my first book, I said this, quote, "God's path and plan to get to the end of this wicked world will be long, painful, shocking, and bloody." And that path includes a lot of war. Indeed, war and its destruction and horrors have been determined by God to continue to the very end of the world, Daniel 9:26. One will notice above that the Antichrist is at the center of most of these end-time wars. Accordingly, the prophecies about him in Daniel describe his warlike nature. It says he will cause astounding and shocking destruction and destroy powerful nations and people, Daniel 8:24. When they feel secure, he will destroy many, as the NIV puts it. Another translation has, he will destroy to an extraordinary degree, he will destroy many while they're at ease. The NLT translates this verse as, he will cause a shocking amount of destruction, he will destroy many without warning. Elsewhere we read, he will attack the mightiest fortresses and still succeed in whatever he does. Daniel chapter 11, verse 39. All of this seems to especially fit Antichrist's surprise attack on end-time Babylon, predicted in Revelation chapter 17 through 18. It might be asked, how could all these devastating wars and riots occur in a world ruled by the Antichrist? Again, Revelation 13 tells us that after Antichrist's resurrection, the whole world will be filled with wonder and follow the beast. People will worship the beast and ask, who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it? And it will be given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life. In addition, it has been argued that the first seal depicts Antichrist's resurrection, occurring at the very beginning of the end times and before the conflicts unleashed in the second seal. So again, how could the devastating wars and riots occur in a world where the Antichrist has already established his complete worship and authority? First, it is unlikely that after Antichrist's resurrection, anyone will attack him. The whole world will be asking, who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it? The united answer of the world will be no one. Accordingly, Revelation describes the Antichrist initiating the attack on end-time Babylon in Revelation chapter 17 through 18, and the attack on Jerusalem at the Battle of Armageddon. The wars unleashed with the opening of the second seal will not be wars against the Antichrist. Finally, while Antichrist worldwide worship and authority will probably prevent civil wars between entire nations, it will not stop public riots and violence, and even rebellion against local authorities. The Bible describes all unbelievers when it says they live in malice and envy, being hated and hating one another, Titus chapter 3, verse 3. In a world led by the Antichrist, there will not only be a growing hatred for Christians, but unbelievers will have a growing hatred for one another. Neither the Antichrist worldwide worship nor authority will be a hindrance to the control and power that people's sinful natures will continue to have over them in the end times. Again, even with the Antichrist in power, Jesus predicted, quote, sin will be rampant everywhere and the love of many will grow cold. Matthew 24, verse 12. Now, in my next message, we'll continue our conversation of these catastrophes during the beginning of birth pains in the third and fourth seals, the famines and plagues and wild beasts that are described there.